Good evening, and welcome to the National Building Museum. My name is Chase Rind, and I am the director here of the museum. Tonight's program, A Green World is a Safe World, is part of an ongoing series called For the Greener Good, Conversations That Will Change the World. The series was launched in 2007 to illustrate the critical relationships between our built and natural environments, and to illuminate how these relationships impact all parts of our national and global society, our economy, our public health, our national security, and the development of our future technologies. Our past programs have been remarkable, with panels of politicians, journalists, CEOs, artists, entrepreneurs, and of course those in the building professions. Our program topics have ranged from suburban development to international slums. Thousands of people have attended this series and are now better equipped to make the right decisions for a more sustainable future. For the Greener Good was an inspired idea for an educational program. We knew it was important to bring together the best minds from different disciplines to discuss the single greatest contributor, the building industry, to global warming. And we also knew that the town hall format would allow all of our guests to be involved and therefore promote a real exchange of ideas. We even wanted to challenge the panelists to think about their own viewpoints differently. So when we developed the concept, we immediately thought of involving a sponsor whom we knew shared this progressive approach, this action-oriented strategy, and this desire to bring everyone to the table to improve the built environment. With their incredible enthusiasm and support, the Home Depot Foundation became our partner in sustainability with their sponsorship of the For the Greener Good series, as well as a range of initiatives that enabled us to leverage technology to disseminate our programs through the web and social media. The foundation also helped us to take some important initial steps to greening our own operations, not a small undertaking for a building like this. The partnership of the Home Depot Foundation began when they became the presenting sponsor of our blockbuster exhibition titled The Green House, New Directions in Sustainable Design and Architecture, and that was in 2006. Since then, they have supported us and offered their expertise on important programs, such as this one, and will help us to publish a major book about sustainability and urban planning that complements our current exhibition, Green Community. Under the leadership of Kelly Caffarelli and Fred Wacker, the Home Depot Foundation's partnership has been steadfast, unwavering, and instrumental in helping us to achieve our mission. Tonight, with great pride and with the deepest gratitude, I would like to announce that the Home Depot Foundation has given the National Building Museum an extraordinary $1.5 million grant. This investment in our mission is truly transformational, and it is unparalleled in our institution's history. It will allow us to create our largest exhibition ever, focusing on the American home, which, as we all know, is an important economic, cultural, and individual experience. The grant will also enable us to continue producing sustainability programs and greening our galleries. Most significantly, it will enable us to continue improving people's lives by educating the public about the importance of the built environment, our mission mandated by Congress in 1980 and honored by the Home Depot Foundation with this grant. I am delighted that the COO of the Home Depot Foundation, Mr. Fred Wacker, could be with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage with a round of applause for what his foundation has done for this museum that we all love. Fred?
Thank you very much, Chase, and we're honored and excited to continue being a partner of the National Building Museum. It's interesting, we're a fairly young foundation. We're 6 years old. And when we were first formed, the focus of our foundation was on making sure that we could build green housing affordable for low and moderate income families. So we reached out to national organizations like LISC and Enterprise and NeighborWorks America and the Housing Assistance Council, the rural intermediary. And what we found was building green that's affordable for low and moderate income families was a slam dunk, that it was easy. And not only was it easy, but we have to do it. Because if we're only building green for the upper end range income families, we're not dealing with a good portion of our population that has a footprint on our environment. We found early on that building low and moderate income housing to green standards, including USGBC standards, is possible. So 2 years ago, we decided as a board that it was time to try and create some systemic change. And how do you do that? We've been dealing with nonprofit housing development intermediaries, but how do we spread this through the entire building industry? And when you think of Home Depot, you know we build with builders and provide the supplies for them. And I remember going before the board and I said, you know, we really need to focus on educating the public, our policymakers, our local governments, that green is not only important, but we can't afford not to do it. And I think one of the individuals that really inspired us and our board is here tonight, Ed Mazria, who really helped us change our strategy going forward. We're still supporting the construction of affordable, efficient, healthy housing, but now we want to focus, in addition, on educating the public. And I remember when I went before my board and said, we need to support the National Building Museum. And the board said, well, why? You know, give me 3 good reasons why we should do this. We have such a good success rate building housing through the nonprofit sector. Why the National Building Museum? So I went back and I pulled out my notes because I had 2 minutes to answer their question, as the typical board requires of program officers. And I said, well, here's 3 reasons why. First, the National Building Museum is dedicated to illuminating and exploring America's built environment and to considering its future. The museum seeks to broaden public understanding and appreciation of architecture, urban planning, preservation, construction, engineering, and design, and to better equip people, you and me, as consumers, to make informed and enlightened choices about the world we live in. That was my first reason. My second reason was that as the only U.S. institution dedicated to exploring all of the building arts and sciences, the National Building Museum is at the forefront of the discussion on sustainability in the built environment. And by documenting and promoting sustainable building practices through exhibitions, many of them you probably have seen here, through accompanying lecture series such as the one that's here tonight, the museum engages a national public in dialogue around these critical issues while relating them to daily life. And I said the third reason was, by partnering with the National Building Museum, our foundation and the Building Museum will continue to focus on raising public awareness, sharing best practices and sustainability among design and building professionals, and using technology to reach a larger audience. And the board unanimously voted we should make this grant. So we're very proud and honored to be your national partner, and we look forward to a long, ongoing relationship. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you, Fred, for your support and your commitment to this museum. I would now like to introduce our panelists for tonight's For the Greener Good program, A Green World is a Safe World. Edward Mazria is an internationally recognized architect with a long and distinguished career. His architecture and planning projects span over a 30-year period, and each of his projects employs a cutting-edge environmental approach to its design. He is the founder of Architecture 2030, a non-traditional and flexible organization focused on protecting our global environment. Tonight, he will be discussing climate change and his 2-year, 9 million jobs investment plan that addresses the current economic crisis by building upon his widely adopted 2030 challenge, an effective strategy for achieving dramatic reductions in energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Following Ed, John Podesta will join the stage. John is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for American Progress. He served as Chief of Staff to President William J. Clinton from October 1998 until January of 2001, where he was responsible for directing, managing, and overseeing all policy development, daily operations, congressional relations, and staff activities of the White House. John is currently a visiting professor of law on the faculty of the Georgetown University Law Center, a position he also held from January of 1995 to 1997. He has taught courses on technology policy, congressional investigations, legislation, copyright, and public interest law. He is considered one of Washington's leading experts in technology policy, and he has written a book, several articles, and lectured extensively in these areas. Richard Harris, science correspondent for National Public Radio, will then join Ed and John in a conversation about the intersection of architecture, sustainability, and our national and international interests. Please join me now in welcoming Ed Mazria.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you, Fred. Fred's been a great supporter of ours, and the Home Depot Foundation does great work. It was just about 30 years ago today that I was asked to come to Washington, D.C. I came along with a group of researchers and colleagues from our national laboratories. I was here then to brief then-President Jimmy Carter on what can be done to reduce energy consumption in the building sector. 30 years later, next week, I've been asked to come to Washington, D.C. to brief Congress on what can be done to reduce energy consumption in the building sector. 30 years ago, at that time it was 1979, we were just heading into a recession, and we had the Iran crisis and oil prices. We had an energy crisis as well. Oil prices went through the roof. Today, the situation is far worse. We have a huge global mess on our hands. We not only have an energy and economic crisis, but a climate and housing crisis as well. So today I'm going to try to answer 3 questions. One, how are these 4 crises interrelated? And it may be a little different than how you think they're interrelated. Second, how can we address all 4 crises simultaneously? And third, why is this now personal? Let me begin with the climate crisis. What are scientists saying? I'm not talking here about the extremes on both sides of this issue, those folks who tie every weather event to climate change, or those folks who think cosmic rays are tied somehow to global warming. What we want to know is what are the scientists that we entrust to do the science? What are they saying? The folks at NASA, Woods Hole, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, our National Academy of Sciences. What are they all saying? They're all saying really the same thing, that we have a problem and we're off the charts. This is global average temperature and CO2 emissions going back 450,000 years. You can see that one sits right on top of the other. CO2 is not called a greenhouse gas for nothing. It's like putting a layer of glass around the Earth. Sun gets through, but it traps the thermal radiation and the heat, and the temperature goes up. We haven't been over 300 parts per million in 450,000 years. Today we're at 385 parts per million. It's a huge experiment. We're going to 400 and probably 450. If we don't do anything, we'll be at 700 by the end of the century. So what does this mean? What are the projections? These don't necessarily have to come true, but what are our scientists telling us? These are our scientists. They're telling us that by 2050, business as usual, 25% of all plant and animal species on Earth will be gone. NASA says that by 2100, that number may increase to 50%. NOAA is saying that by 2050, most of our coral reefs will be bleached. That's home to 25% of all marine species on the planet. We've heard about drought in the West. We know that forest fires with increasing temperatures will expand and acreage burned. We've heard about warmer air temperatures being able to hold more moisture so that weather becomes more extreme. We've heard the tie to not increased hurricane activity, but hurricane intensity and water content due to warming temperatures. But we've also heard two other things, that Greenland is now really in a stage of melt, and just the latest week ago that Antarctica is actually warming when we thought the interior might be cooling. Well, what does that mean for the U.S.? We have heard a lot of talk about 1 meter of sea level rise in Bangladesh and wiping out a huge portion of that coastline and putting 1 million people on the move, and with the possibility of dramatic consequences in India. But what does it mean for the U.S.? I'm not talking about the 6 meters that you hear all the time argued in the media. I'm talking about what does 1 meter or 1 meter plus mean for the United States? Well, this is sea level rise. This goes back to the 1950s, and you can see in about 1956, you can see that all of a sudden the rate of sea level rise is doubling. And we now know from NASA that that doubling is due to ice melt at the polar ice caps. And from Josh Willis, the latest figures just came in, 2008 figures, and we're right on track with that level of sea level rise. Well, what that means for the U.S. Is not good. 53% of all Americans live in and around coastal cities and towns. This is Hurricane Ike. This past September, I was giving a lecture in Denver. I was about to go give the lecture. Hurricane Ike was approaching the coastline, so I got on the Weather Channel and I downloaded this just before I left to give the lecture. The reason I did is because we had just completed a study for the newspaper in Galveston, Texas, on the vulnerability of Galveston to sea level rise, and this is 1.5 to 2 meters of sea level rise in Galveston. The whole island is pretty much underwater. And sure enough, 3 meters of sea level rise came ashore as Hurricane Ike pushed the water up against the island and back into the bay, and we had 3 meters of sea level rise. And we knew then, and we showed the slide, the previous slide at the conference, that this is what was going to happen to Galveston. Well, we've completed the largest sea level rise study in the United States. NOAA uses our work. National Academy of Sciences has been presented with our work. We've taken a look at very, very fine data and got all the way down to 1 meter and less than 1 meter to see what would happen along our coastline. We have looked at over 100 locations. That's hundreds of cities and towns, because each location might have a few cities and towns in it. I'm going to take you down just a few to see what would happen in the U.S. with just 1 meter. We're not talking about Bangladesh here. We're talking about the U.S. Let's start up in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. That's just 1 meter of sea level rise. In fact, almost every location along the coast in New Jersey is affected like that. This is Elizabeth City, North Carolina. That's 1 meter. That's 1.5 meters, and then at 2 meters, the whole place is gone. Go down to Charleston, South Carolina, one of our most beautiful cities. That's 1 meter of sea level rise, and at 1.5 meters, It wouldn't survive a meter, basically. We go down to Hollywood, Florida. That's just a meter of sea level rise. Those are houses in there, and churches, and community centers, and government buildings, and housing. This is Miami Beach, Florida. Miami Beach is on a porous underrock, so wherever sea level is, that's where, when you dig down, that's where the level of water is. This is just 1 meter of sea level rise. It wouldn't survive. Go over to Tampa, Florida. The downtown area would be inundated with 1.5 meters of sea level rise. New Orleans, the whole southern part of Louisiana is pretty much gone with 1 meter of sea level rise. Up the West Coast, the Bay Area is hit pretty hard. This is Silicon Valley, Foster City, the San Mateo area. That's just 1 meter of sea level rise. We have documented hundreds of locations in the U.S., and I can tell you that the U.S. can't survive a meter of sea level rise. It would be total chaos in this country, with thousands of people on the move and trillions of dollars of infrastructure lost. And it would be a rolling catastrophe. It just doesn't stop. Once this starts, it keeps going. So we're not talking about Bangladesh here. What are scientists telling us? How much time do we have? Well, 2 years ago, it was 7 years. And some scientists now are screaming that we got 4 or 5 years, and if we don't get it done with this administration, then all is lost. So what's the solution? Well, I gave this problem out to our staff, and I said, okay, I want you to think hard, and I want you to come up with a solution to this problem, because we need to get it right in the first time. So this is what they came up with first. But we discounted it because it took about 100 years to build the ark. So we got serious and we said, okay, what are our other options? Well, there really is only one, and that is that we need to confront the problem, and we need to confront it very, very quickly. Well, make no mistake, this is the second crisis. Climate change is an energy problem. You cannot separate the two, and energy has two sides to the coin, supply and demand. Let's take a look at the supply side first. Who's the culprit? On the supply side, watch this graph closely. On the bottom is CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere. In pre-industrial times, as the vertical line was, we were about 250, 260 parts per million CO2. This is how much oil, gas, and coal we burned to date, and that's moved the line over to about 350 parts per million. Now, this is proven reserves. These are probably overblown, because the Middle East, we understand, overestimates their oil and gas reserves. But that's how much oil we have left and how much gas we have left. Maybe it's less. We're about peaking in oil. We've either peaked globally, we're about to peak in 2011, 2010. We're peaking right now. We're somewhere around the peak. And when you hit the peak, what happens is the price of the commodity goes way up, and you look for alternatives. They become real lucrative, and you never use up all of that commodity because it just becomes too expensive. So we will use up very little of the rest of the oil and gas. We will be looking for alternatives very hard in the next few years as the price goes up, especially if we come out of this recession, deep recession. So in essence, the good news is that oil and gas can't fuel climate change because it's only going to move the line over a bit. And scientists know that. Now let's take a look at where those reserves are. 70% of the remaining oil and gas reserves are located in that ellipse, which is called the strategic ellipse, an area stretching from Saudi Arabia up through the Islamic republics, the Islamic countries to the Islamic republics of the Soviet Union. Not the friendliest place in the world. We have a huge energy security problem on our hands. That's another reason we won't be using all that oil and gas. So that's the good news. Oil and gas can fuel global warming. Well, what about coal? Well, if we burn all the coal we have in the world and it's distributed nicely throughout the world, it'll fuel global warming 7 times over. So when you hear folks talk about, well, there's no silver bullet, we got to do this and we got to do that and we got to do this, and they make it so complex that people throw up their hands and can't do anything. There is a silver bullet. And the silver bullet is no more coal without carbon capture and sequestration. Period. We stop that and we phase out coal between now and the year 2030, we stop global warming when we get back to 350 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and we'll talk about how to do that. But there's a demand side. Energy is not only supply, but it's demand. And if we keep demanding the coal, we're going to be in trouble. I want you to take a look at the three lines. We start off at about 10 quads. Building sector, industrial sector, and the transportation sector. They're all around 10, 12, 15 quads. And then watch them as they move. Watch the blue line. That's the building sector. You see it increasing and now starting to separate. We get into 1973 with the oil crisis, then the Iran crisis. We level out. As soon as that's over, we begin to increase, and you see the discrepancy between the building sector and the transportation and industrial sector. The building sector today is responsible for over 50 quads of energy. Our total energy consumption is about 100 quads. That's building the buildings and running buildings. Running the buildings, operating buildings are 42% of total energy consumption, about 8% for building the buildings on an annual basis. Now let's see what the EIA projects. We're in a recession. Between now and the year 2030, they project a few years' worth of recession. Everything's going to be flat. And then you see the building sector take off again as we add to our building stock. And so by the year 2030, they expect the building sector to be over 58 quads of energy. But you can see the difference. The building sector is driving the energy crisis and is driving the climate change crisis. Again, 50% of all U.S. energy consumption goes to buildings, 42% of that for building operations. And when we talk about coal and we talk about U.S. electricity consumption, 75% of everything that comes out of those power plants goes just to operate buildings. The road to energy independence and getting a handle on climate change runs through the building sector. So a few years ago, we issued the 2030 challenge. And what that started with was we called for a 50% energy consumption reduction standard for all new and renovated buildings below the regional average for the building type. So if you're doing a school in Washington, D.C., you take the aggregate of all the schools here, you figure out what that is, your budget's 50%, meet it. We're at about 42 quads now of energy in the building sector to operate buildings. We're expected to increase that dramatically between now and 2030. If we meet the 50% target, because we renovate and build about the same amount of square footage, and then we tear down actually a bunch more, and if we call for all renovations to meet that same target, we level out emissions and energy consumption in the building sector. And then we call for a reduction going down to 60% by 2010, 70% by 2015, 80% by 2020, 90% by 2025, and carbon neutral, which is the challenge, by 2030. I'm happy to say the Obama administration has picked up on a pledge to make all buildings carbon neutral by 2030, but they have to follow through. So who's supporting the 2030 challenge? Pretty much everyone. Everyone is supporting the targets, even overseas. The Royal Architectural Institute of Canada adopted it. Big article today up in Canada about how they're trying to meet that target. We have 4 or 5 states that have adopted it. The state of California is going even further, calling for net zero by 2020 in the residential sector, 2030 in their commercial sector, and actually in the bill, Energy Independence and Security Act, that was signed in 2007, the federal government adopted it. Most people don't know this, but by 2010, all new buildings and major renovations, federal buildings and major renovations need to meet a 55% energy consumption performance reduction standard going to carbon neutral by 2030. I'm not sure that President Bush knew what he was signing when he signed that, but he did sign it. It was kind of buried in there. Kind of slipped it in. So how do we meet the challenge? Well, there are three ways. We say the first way is through design, planning, and innovation. That's everything from how you orient your building to where you put the windows, shading devices, what materials you make it, what color the roof is. These are the no-cost, low-cost, cost-changing, cost-savings options. And we know it can be done because in the first energy crisis, why we were called to D.C. in the first place, we had all sorts of demonstration programs demonstrating how to do it. This was the Mount Airy Library in North Carolina. There was no additional budgets, by the way, for this. There were like 16, 18 buildings. They said, okay, we're not going to give you any more money. We're just going to give you money for a consultant, and let's see how much you can reduce your consumption. Well, we reduced 80% of the Mount Airy Library energy consumption just through design strategies alone. And every other architect and designer on that in that program did the same. We've done it in housing, we've done it in schools, we've done it in houses of worship, we've done it in all-glass conservatories, a 90% reduction. And we say if you can't make it that way, add technology. We have a lot more technology than we had back in the 70s and 80s today. Photovoltaics, EMS systems, operable, movable shading devices tied to the sun, solar hot water heating. There's all sorts of technologies we can bring to bear on this problem. And we say if you can't make it those two ways to get the reductions, then buy the rest. Don't buy coal-generated electricity, conventional coal. And why does it make sense to do it the way we're talking about? To generate a quad, a delivered quad of energy. Remember, we burn 100 quads, we deliver about 70. So to deliver a quad of energy in this country, if we were to build a new coal plant today, a dirty old coal plant, conventional coal plant, costs $122 billion. You need to build about 41,000 megawatt plants to get a quad. If we try to do it with CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, at the price Future Gen was stopped because the price was going even past that, it would cost $256 billion plus. We don't know what the plus would be. If you try to build it with nuclear today, at the price Florida Power and Light is paying, and we don't know whether that's going to be the final price, but if we just take that price, we're at $222 billion. McKinsey tells us, and we know this for a fact, that we can get a quad out of the building sector for $42 billion bucks. It's cheap, and it's the way to go. So what are we asking for? We're asking for federal legislation. We're asking, and I'll be asking for this next week, that we update the National Model Energy Code standards 2010, 30% below code. We want 30% below by 2010 the codes that are in place now, which are not that great in the first place. By 2016, and we give the states 2 years to adopt, by 2016, we want the National Model Code to be 50% better than today's energy codes. And we want it to be a performance code, and I'll tell you why in a minute. 2022, 75%, and 2028 carbon neutral, giving the states 2 years so we meet the 2030 deadline of carbon neutral. Why performance standards? Because performance codes give you a target and you meet it any way you want or you can. And so it doesn't pick energy technology winners and losers, and that really gets to the heart of what America's all about. We like to compete, and we like to come up with the best solutions, and this will get the best solutions on the table. And then we say, develop REACH codes. Have the DOE develop REACH codes so that those states and those cities that want to actually go further, and there are plenty of them, Albuquerque, Denver, Austin, Dallas, they all want to do better, they can adopt a standard code. And so every year, as we ratchet the codes up, we have reach codes that other cities and states can adopt, so we have examples out there all the way out to 2028 and 2030. So what happens if we do this? If we get the National Model Energy Code standard, we require the states and local governments to adopt it or at least incentivize it heavily, and the reach codes. There are some legal issues with that. But this is oil out to 2030. This is EIA projections between now and the year 2030. Oil's used in Hawaii, basically. That's Hawaii, that line down there, to generate electricity. They're 100% on oil. This is the nuclear projections. Actually goes up about a little over a quad. This is what the projections are for nuclear between now and 2030. This is the EIA. Natural gas remains pretty level because the price is going to go up and we're not going to add too much more capacity. Renewables, however, is expected to go up over 2 quads of energy. But look at their projections for coal. Coal is expected to increase by about 3.5 quads. This is our own federal EIA. Unacceptable, obviously. If we implement, well, total increase is a little over 7 quads. Almost all of it is building operations. 7 quads, building operations. So you've got to get a handle on the building sector. If we aggressively implement the codes and standards and incentivize the reach codes, we can easily get down 17 quads from the projections. And if we increase our renewables and set a clean energy standard, whether it's a renewable portfolio standard or a clean energy standard, we call it a clean energy standard because we don't care as long as it's clean. If we have a 30%, just a 30% by 2030, which is doable, we then make up almost the entire difference. And if we incentivize homeowner choices to buy the better boiler, change out your lights, and those kinds of things, we can phase out coal or conventional coal between now and the year 2030. It's actually very doable. But we have another problem. Our economy is really sinking quite rapidly. But we see that as a huge opportunity, which is now hopefully not about to be missed. Let me take you through this very quickly. We just are going to invest $787 billion in the first stimulus plan. A lot of that money, if it goes into the building sector, is going into the public building sector, our schools, our infrastructure. A lot of it's going into there. Some weatherization that'll go into public housing, but some will go into the private sector. But most of the money is going into the public building sector. Public building sector represents 7% of total U.S. building square footage. The private building sector represents 93%. Today we just had the housing plan stimulus that's going to either buy down or extend out or reduce mortgage payments for maybe 8 to 9 to 10 million homes. Those that are about to be foreclosed or those that are underwater significantly to try to get those folks some help. Not tied, we don't think, to anything, although we don't know the details of that. That's not going to work. You're not going to bring the building sector back. The building sector is this huge black hole that's dragging the entire economy down with it. And when you just stop the foreclosures, you're stopping a small percentage of that. You've got to bring the sector back. And so how do we do that? We're calling for $96 billion a year for 2 years, $192 billion, to invest in the public building sector, paid back, though, so it's revenue neutral. I'll show you how we think that it's going to work. For homes, what we're calling for is a mortgage buy-down. National Association of Home Builders is screaming for a mortgage buy down. National Association of Realtors, I think, wants the same thing so that people can afford new homes. But just selling new homes doesn't put anyone, not going to put the building sector back to work by just dropping mortgage rates. So we want the rates tied to energy reduction targets. So for existing buildings, we want it to be more robust than for new buildings. So look at the column on the left. You want a 4% loan? We'll give you a 4% loan. You get 30% under code. You want a 3.5% loan? Give you that. You get 50% under code. You want a 2% loan? You get the carbon neutral. You tie the reduction to an energy reduction standard. And for commercial buildings, we do the same thing, but we do accelerated depreciation and tie it to energy consumption reductions. Let's take a look at how that works. Let's take a look at the 2.5%, 75% below. I'm an existing homeowner. I have a mortgage. Let's say the average is about $272,300 in the U.S. Let's say I refinanced at 6% a bunch of years ago. I bought it down $12,000. So I have $12,000 equity in it. I'm paying about $1,600 a month. That doesn't include taxes and stuff. That's rough. Now we say, I want to get my building 75% under code. It's going to cost me maybe $51,000. That's actually it's a good price for an existing building. Well, the homeowner is going to think twice about that. He's going to save $150 a month on his mortgage, and in this climate, he's not going to do it. Along comes Uncle Sam with the investment. He says, okay, we'll give you a $2,000, 2.5% mortgage if you get 75% under. You invest the $51,000. And we'll also give you a tax credit for the solar system if your income is under a certain amount. Now you have to go out and take out a $304,000 mortgage. You have to refinance, but now your mortgage rate, your monthly mortgage is $1,200. You've spent $51,000 putting people back to work. So in order to get a federal dollar, you have to spend $5 or $6, but you make out in the long run. So tied to every federal dollar are jobs, and that's what's missing in all the stimulus. All the stimulus is essentially trying to stop the bleeding right now. But we've got to get the economy back on track, and we've got to tie every dollar to a maximum amount of private investment. So look at the savings. The feds buy down the mortgage, and those rates can be adjustable, tied to whatever the actual mortgage rates are now. But the person saves $429 on his mortgage every month. He has more expendable income, plus he's saving now $144 a month on energy costs, which is literally burned up and thrown out and doesn't enter back into the economy. And now it does. So you recapture that amount of money and put it back into the economy. And when you invest in the building sector and you put every federal dollar and private dollars back to work, you bring back every industry, every conceivable industry in the U.S. because they're all tied to the building sector. Everything from steel and metals to caulking to paint to glass to wood, our framers, our electricians, everyone who's hurting now, Home Depot, Caterpillar, everyone is tied to the building sector. If you don't bring the building sector back, you cannot bring this economy back. Even architects and engineers, by the way, are tied to the building sector. So, in closing, we say we need to invest in the public building sector. It's time now for that part of the stimulus to emerge. Why? Because if we invest $192 billion, we create automatically 9 million jobs. You can't invest the money and not create the jobs, because if you invest the money, you have to do the construction. You create $1 trillion in private spending, because that's how much it's going to take to do all those renovations. You create a whole new renovation market that's worth over $200 billion. You save folks between $44 and $69 billion that goes, again, back into the economy on energy savings and their mortgage savings. You reduce our energy consumption by over 2 quads in just those 2 years. You save 168 million metric tons of CO2 by the efficiency standards, 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, 36 million barrels of oil. And the beauty of it is, with the 9 million new jobs, the taxes paid by those workers and manufacturers and businesses goes right back to the federal government to keep the funding going so that it's revenue neutral. It's actually more money coming back to the feds than the feds have to lay out. So this is the trajectory that we're on. This is what NASA is telling us. This is where we are in 2008, and that is business as usual, CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere. We're literally flying off this chart as we speak. If we can phase out coal through the building sector by incentivizing the building sector and getting a jump start through the stimulus, and we can phase out coal between now and 2030, we get close to the 350 parts per million that some of our scientists are telling us we need to get to between now and 2100. We don't quite get there, but with increased forestry and building back up our forests and our soil's capacity to take up CO2, scientists feel we can get back to the 350 parts per million. The road to solving climate change, our energy independence problem and our energy problem, and our economic woes runs right through the building sector. And if we don't get it if we don't get it right this time, we don't make it. Thank you.
Ed's computer down. Thanks. I feel like maybe I should just sit down. We should bring Richard up here, and we should just kind of go at it, because I agree with almost everything that Ed just said. I'm John Podesta. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. I do want to also thank Chase and Scott for inviting me to take part of in this series. To thank the National Building Museum for hosting this. I think the issues you're drawing attention to really are critical at this time, as Ed powerfully laid out. And I want to thank the Home Depot Foundation for giving the support to the Building Museum and for this program. I would note that as a CEO of a think tank, that we fully support the efforts to ensure that all buildings are carbon neutral in 2030, and we've been pressing the political system to deal with that. I think the one thing, I guess, that I would suggest after Scott's presentation is I am under no illusion that meeting this goal, or the broader climate challenge for that matter, is going to be easy. This is tough work. It needs policy. It needs the dedication of the people in this room and the people holding office around the country, both at the federal and in state and local level as well, and really needs the support of the private sector and the NGO sector as well. We're nearing the end of the first decade of the 21st century. We've obviously not kicked our oil addiction, as Ed pointed out, nor have we fundamentally moved our economy away from dependence on fossil fuels. If you look at that chart over the last year, the line kept going straight up. We need to move towards a clean, renewable energy model, and as a result, the United States, I think, is still releasing, to this day, carbon dioxide and other global warming pollutants into the atmosphere at near record levels. I only use the word near because I don't think actually having a profound recession on the scale of probably what we experienced in the 1930s is actually the solution to the energy problem we face. Hopefully we'll actually create growth again and put people back to work, and that's if we don't get on a different energy trajectory, we're gonna be right back to where we were over the past decade. Most of you, I think, care about a sustainable economy, a sustainable environment. I think you get the urgency of this. Ed tried to bring this down to the level of what's going to happen in Tampa and Galveston and New York City and on the West Coast. He sort of, I think, threw away or used the Bangladesh as the punching bag for why maybe we shouldn't care, why it was a lack of concern. I actually want to bring you a little bit. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what's going on in Bangladesh and why we ought to be worried about it in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East and the challenge of climate change to our security posture, and then follow up with some ideas that I think build on what Ed was talking about for the building sector and talk about where we are today politically in the environment that we see as a result of the new recovery bill that was just passed, and what more we need to do to get on with the project of transforming our economy from a high carbon base to a low carbon energy base. The national security costs of oil dependence are well documented. Ed went through them. There's widespread awareness that our foreign policy is warped by dependence on unstable and hostile regime. Remember when you go home that oval of where the oil and gas resource is in the world. And there's, of course, enormous economic cost to this dependence as well. By some estimates, we spent about $500 billion on imported oil last year. It's a staggering figure. It's a huge chunk, about a third of what our balance of payments deficit is. As pressing as these challenges are today, however, I believe that they will in fact pale in comparison to the threat that climate change poses to our economy, our environment, and our national security. We're already experiencing the harmful effects of climate change, and they're quickly going to worsen. I'm not talking about over the next 90 years, but over the next decade or two. It takes the form of crop losses, intense tropical cyclones, wildfires, climate-induced human migration, increased food shortages, water scarcity, and the spread of disease. In the abstract, really actually over 100 years, if you think about even the challenge of moving Miami back a mile or so up to higher ground, maybe one could wrap their head around the way a society could, over the course of a century, adjust to a dramatically warmer climate. But consider what that means in practice in the near term. Take, for existence, the much-used Bangladesh, which scientists have identified as one of the places that is, in fact, of greatest risk to the effects of climate change in the near term. I think we all learned, at least in 2001, that things that happen in South Asia, in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, come back and bite us in America. So it's not just what's happening in our own backyards, but what's happening around the globe in terms of these security challenges. It's inevitable that Bangladesh, with a population of now 150 million people today, it's headed towards 250 million people if there's no interruption in the next couple of decades, will endure increasingly severe floods and cyclones as the temperature around the Earth's equator climbs. We're going to talk about millions of displaced people by future storms and floods. They'll have no choice but to become climate refugees. They're going to pour over the border into India. For those of you who don't know it, India is building a fence. We're not the only country building a fence between our borders. India is building a fence to control its border. Nor will coping with climate refugees from South Asia and from other areas affected, particularly in Africa, will be exclusively a regional challenge that has to be dealt with by the neighbors. There's likely to be a surge in the number of immigrants from South Asia, from Africa to the European Union, which will exacerbate existing tensions and increase the likelihood of radicalization amongst Europe's growing and often poorly assimilated, particularly Islamic communities. At the same time, higher temperatures are causing Himalayan glacier system to shrink rapidly, according to the IPCC, which is composed of the leading scientists, as you know, from around the world. If current warming rates are maintained, those glaciers will continue to retreat at disastrous rates until they'll probably vanish altogether. That's alarming if for no other reason than glacier meltwater is one of the main sources of potable and agricultural water, not just to the much-mentioned Bangladesh, but to all of South Asia. It constitutes as much as 70% of the flow in the Ganges during the dry season. As the rivers diminish, the likelihood of regional conflict grows. Our friend Dick Holbrook was just sent off to Pakistan and India. I think that it's fair to say this is the most dangerous, probably the most dangerous region in the world, certainly the heart of where the Taliban and the remnants of Al-Qaeda still exist. A.K. Singh, a former commander-in-chief of India's Air Force, put it this way: rivers that feed Pakistan and Bangladesh go through India. If their flow is reduced to a trickle because of shrinking glaciers, we won't release water to them because there won't be enough for Indian agriculture. It's all too easy to imagine how rapidly and dangerously such a situation could escalate. Africa will also present an enormous security challenge in the near future. Climate change is going to create fluctuations in the amount of rainfall in East Africa during the next, not 90 years, but in the next 30 years. As a 5 to 20% increase in rainfall during the winter months will cause flooding and soil erosion, and a 5 to 10% decrease in summer months is going to cause severe droughts. That'll jeopardize the livelihood of millions of people and the economic capacity of the region. Agriculture constitutes 40% of East Africa's GDP. 80% of the population earns a living from agriculture. So think about these in human terms, but also these factors, I think, combined with a high concentration of weak and failing states and numerous festering political disputes. They're an extremely volatile mix and extremely should be a high priority for U.S. national security policy. The entire Horn of Africa is threatened by a failed Somalia today and other weak states. Al-Qaeda cells are active in the region. There's danger that this area could become a central breeding ground and a safe haven for jihadists as climate change pushes more states to the brink of collapse. On the other side of the African continent, Nigeria will be severely tested by climate change as well. It will suffer from climate-induced drought, desertification, and sea level rise all at the same time. Desertification coming from the north, sea level rise from the south. Already, approximately 1,350 square miles of Nigerian land turns to desert each year, forcing both farmers and herdsmen to abandon their homes. The coastal city of Lagos, which is the second largest city in Africa, has been identified by the IPCC as at risk from sea level rise, combined with the fact that Nigeria is the most populous nation in Africa and that 3/4 of the population is under the age of 30. It's easy to see why the risk of political economic turmoil and severe the security consequences are really dire there. Closer to home, if you want to think about it that way, Mexico is experiencing increasingly severe water shortages due to climate change. That's going to happen in our own desert Southwest, which will drive from Mexico immigration into the United States. When President-elect Obama and President Calderon met during the transition, this was a key issue in their dialogue, how we're going to move to a clean energy future that would deal with the consequences of climate change. Likewise, the damage caused by the storms and rising sea levels, again, that Ed talked about in our own shores, think about that with respect to what it's going to do to the Caribbean, in the Caribbean islands where 60% of the population lives, will increase. That'll increase immigration flows, put more pressure on an already great political tension in our own society. So when you add it all up, one thing's clear. And I think that, again, I think Ed underscored this. The cost of inaction is monstrously high. People worry about the cost of acting. We should all tonight be worried about the cost of inaction. And to meet this the challenge, we have to do no less than transform our economy to one based on clean and renewable energy sources, and we've got to do it now. Fortunately, I think there's been a sea change in the approach that our national government is taken to this energy challenge. I had the honor and privilege of serving as President-elect Obama's co-chair during the transition phase. And I think that I can say with great certainty that he both appreciates the urgency of the situation, is quite knowledgeable about it. I think that that's indicated by the people he appointed to his top-level appointments, reaching into the scientific community to get Nobel Prize winner Stephen Chu in the Energy Department, to put Ms. Jackson at EPA, Nancy Sutley at CEQ, came from the Los Angeles Environment Office, Ken Salazar, who views federal lands as not only a source of oil and gas, but a source of clean, renewable energy at the Interior Department, and of course my friend Carol Browner in the new office that is coordinating climate and energy policy for the president. He's also already appointed a special envoy, a former fellow at the Center for American Progress, Todd Stern, who's with Secretary Clinton as she travels to Asia and to China this week to be a special envoy to the negotiations that will culminate in Copenhagen at the end of the year. He's also, I think, taken strong executive action. He issued a memorandum in the first week triggering the process at EPA to allow California and 16 other states to impose auto emission standards that are more stringent than the federal requirement. We talked a lot about the building sector, but we also got to work on the transportation sector to take carbon out of the way we use and make more efficient the entire transportation sector. He also ordered the transportation department to put into effect new CAFE fuel efficiency standards, as was another feature of the 2007 bill, which made a major emphasis on trying to increase efficiency both in buildings and the cars that we drive. But this is not a challenge then that we can meet, obviously, through domestic action alone. We must also make energy and climate one of our core diplomatic initiatives. I was recently in Norway for an energy conference where most of the discussion, it was a discussion amongst particularly amongst oil executives, was about the challenges posed by Russia and the oil and gas policies put forward, particularly by Prime Minister Putin. They're a top concern in Europe, as you know. It's certainly a critical issue because Europe is as dependent on Russian natural gas as perhaps we are on foreign oil. But I believe that when it comes to climate and energy in the future, nowhere will winning cooperation require more skill and diplomacy than our relationship with China. Again, we talked about the domestic side this evening. I want to talk a little bit about the international side. I think it's a promising sign that Secretary of State Clinton will be in Beijing on Friday, and that energy and climate are the top of the agenda for her first visit to Asia. I don't underestimate just how difficult it'll be to gain China's support for policies that will tie them into a global regime to cap and reduce emissions. China's political leaders, of course, have staked their legitimacy on delivering rapid economic growth year after year, making them resistant to anything that they think might curb short-term growth. They're experiencing a deep recession as a result of the global downturn that we are experiencing here today. So they're concerned about where their growth is going to come from as well. If we embark, I think, today on a trade war between our two countries, I think it'll have a lot of ramifications, but clearly with respect to how we negotiate a climate protection in the future. So it's very important, I think, that she's there and opening up a conversation with the Chinese. I think one thing that I should note is that there's, of course, a growing awareness in China, both amongst the leadership and the general public, that their environmental crisis is rapidly worsening and that their government needs to do more to address it. So it's a domestic issue in China as well. China recently released an annual survey of public attitudes about the environment. More than 3/4 of the respondents ranked environmental problems there as very serious or relatively serious. That's up 20 percentage points from a decade ago. And as climate change worsens, China will feel the very profound effects in terms of desertification, loss of their water resource, major crop loss in China. So I believe that that growing domestic pressure in China to address environmental problems, coupled with a renewed diplomatic push by the United States, could provide a new diplomatic opportunity for constructive engagement. In my view, that must be that new relationship, however, must not be driven solely by negotiations over a treaty, even the one that will be on the table in Copenhagen, but rather has to be rooted in a series of clearly defined cooperative energy and environmental initiatives that will fundamentally change the landscape for both of our countries. China has passed us as the global CO2 emitter. We're, of course, about 4 times on a per capita basis bigger than where China is. President Bush did start a bilateral dialogue on this question, led by Secretary Paulson, but I think that was a little bit too little and a little bit too late. But clearly, I think we can get on with new initiatives that would include a program to link U.S. and Chinese cities in order to promote direct subnational cooperation in what I think are 2 key areas. One is EDS, which is improved energy efficiency for all new and existing buildings. That's something I think the Chinese have taken on somewhat seriously, and I think we could probably learn from each other and certainly improve their capacity there. And also to improve and expand mass transit systems, which are challenges, again, for both of our countries. I think we also have to launch co-funded joint research to deal with clean renewable energies, particularly solar and storage technologies. And we need to begin working immediately on building large-scale carbon capture and sequestration demonstration projects in the U.S. and China. I was watching Ed's graph, particularly at the end, where we're taking coal out of the system. He basically, I think, excluded carbon capture and sequestration, but if you looked at the number of what it's going to cost to bring in carbon capture and sequestration, you would argue that if we were looking at this solely, I think, from a domestic perspective, you might abandon carbon capture and sequestration in favor of much more expansive use of clean renewable technologies, wind, solar, geothermal, the efficiency improvements that he talked about. But there's no question that around the globe, I think there's going to be a lot of burning of coal, and we've got to find a way to do it that takes the carbon out of the atmosphere. And sequestration and demonstration of sequestration and some innovative technologies on sequestration, I think, have to be a joint project of the global community, including the Europeans as well. The United States is clearly going to lack credibility needed to lead on this issue until we get our own house in order and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, fundamentally transform the way we produce and consume energy. I think this bill that the President signed in Denver that was passed in record time is an important step in the right direction. Of that $787 billion, there are about $71 billion for clean energy programs and about $20 billion in clean energy tax incentives included in that. It's a major thrust and it's a reason I think that people keep referring to this as the stimulus bill and how much will it stimulate the economy. I think that there was a reason that the President changed the nomenclature from stimulus to recovery and reinvestment. I think he understood the depth of where we were going in terms of this downturn in the economy and the theory behind this bill, both on healthcare, education, energy, the other major components, are building the platform for future growth and sustainable growth. The Weatherization Assistance Program alone will receive an additional $5 billion, which will allow the weatherization of 1 million homes. There's $4.5 billion for federal green buildings to do the public retrofits that have been previously discussed. $8.4 billion for transit projects, an additional $8 billion for high-speed rail, $17 billion in spending on and loan guarantees for smart grid technology, and which will build out 3,000 miles of new transmission and give us the capacity, including putting smart meters in 40 million homes. These investments, I think, in renewable energy and energy efficiency will do more than reduce emissions. Obviously, the need is to create jobs, as has already been noted. The center put out a piece with a Political Economic Research Institute of University of Massachusetts that argued for $100 million in investment that could create 2 million jobs over 2 years. Not quite the 9 million jobs that Ed's talking about, but ours were concentrated to some extent in this public building sector and in particularly in the mass transit sector. That's 4 times as many jobs that would be created by investing a similar level in oil and gas production. So the bill that was just passed at the President's side, I would take note of the fact that he signed it at a solar installation in Denver, Colorado, is an important first step, but we've got to ensure the long-term health of our economy and our environment. We've got to do more. A critical piece in addition to these building codes that have been discussed is to put a price on carbon by implementing a cap-and-trade system. That'll establish a ceiling on greenhouse gas emissions and allow the market to establish the cost of those pollutants. For too long, the profits of dirty energy have been privatized while the costs have been socialized. Taxpayers are picking up the cost of the use of fossil fuels while the fossil fuel companies are taking away the profit. I think it's time to end that practice and to take out that hidden subsidy. Once in place, a cap-and-trade system is projected to generate something like on the order of $200 billion in revenue annually. Half of that could be used to return to the taxpayers to offset the short-term increase in energy prices, while the other half can go towards building the public investments that would further accelerate and to provide the private capital to accelerate the energy transformation and complement new energy policies. And in the long run, and maybe even in the short run, again on the building sector side in particular, if you looked at the McKinsey study, reduce energy bills by deploying technologies that enhance end-use efficiency. There are a number of areas that warrant immediate investment and new policies. I just want to mention 3, and then I'll sit down and we'll take questions. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, and transmission. On efficiency, it never sounds like something that's very exciting or cutting edge, but it's that if we introduce a national energy efficiency resource standard that would require utilities to meet energy savings targets, some states have already done that, we could go a long way towards reaping the benefits that have been discussed. We also have to do a better job of setting efficiency standards for appliances. That's been a feature of the federal law. The Bush administration, I think, sort of dropped the ball on this. They issued only 2 new standards over the last 8 years, despite the impressive records of appliance efficiency improvements that we saw. At the same time, I think we can boost the efficiency in the building sector that's already been discussed, and that's being invested in this bill. Second, we got to change the way we generate electricity by increasing production of renewable power. One way to do that is by establishing a renewable electricity standard that requires utilities to generate 20% of their electricity from wind, solar, and geothermal, that other big bar that was shown on Ed's chart. 28 states have similar targets. The House of Representatives twice in the last Congress passed the renewable electricity standard. The Senate blocked it with opposition from the administration. The Obama administration's asked Senator Reid and Speaker Pelosi to move that standard in the next legislative period. Senator Reid said this morning that they intend to do that in the next couple of weeks. And third and finally, we've got to overhaul our electric grid, which is frail and antiquated. What we need is a clean energy smart grid that will utilize advanced information technology, enable us to tap into our nation's vast potential for wind and solar power generation. A truly national clean energy smart grid consists of 2 distinct components. We've got to create an interstate sustainable transmission grid that can take the vast resources we have for solar in the Southwest, wind in the Midwest, and in Texas, and move them distances to markets. And we need a digital smart distribution grid to deliver the electricity efficiently to local consumers. The absence of a national grid that seamlessly integrates these 2 components is one of the biggest impediments to large-scale deployment of low-carbon electricity. I think that even on the building technology side, a lot of the improvements have to come with forcing smart technology into those buildings so that the electricity use ends up being put in the hands of consumers, both at the commercial building level, but increasingly at the consumer level. Monday, we're hosting a National Clean Energy Forum with Senator Reid to draw attention to the real need to make these grid improvements. And a smart grid strategy really needs the following core elements. We now have a balkanized system. States regulate the transmission side. It's very hard to get these renewable investments done and to market when you're crossing state lines. So we need a multi-state planning process. We need greater federal authority to work with the states to site clean energy corridors. There needs to be broad-based cost allocation, so this is viewed as more of a national priority than just what's happening in individual localities in the cities and states that are at the forefront of this. And fourth, we need to set the right kind of standards, not just the standards for buildings, but the standards for the deployment of the information technologies which will power all that. I want to conclude by saying that even among people who understand that energy and climate challenge needs to be addressed, there are some who argue that our country has too many other problems. The recession's too deep. Energy can wait. We got to get back to take care of the housing crisis, the banking crisis, the financial crisis. I think that's the worst possible option. I think that as President Obama, I think, has signaled in the construction of this recovery bill, long-term growth, job growth, a sustainable economy is going to be built around the transformation of our energy system, the way we produce and consume energy. That is the next big thing in the American economy. That will get the American economy back to work. It'll put people back to work. It'll create real jobs that pay decent wages and provide decent benefits. So I think that at the heart of a recovery program has to be tackling this energy challenge. So I will close where Ed closed, which is the path towards a sustainable economic future for this country runs not only through buildings, but through building out an energy system that produces clean, renewable energy, delivers it to market, and delivers it in an efficient way that provides people with a decent quality of life, good jobs, and a sustainable future. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for a stimulating conversation. I wish it were a little more cheerful. And I wish my first question were a little more cheerful, because I think that it would be nice to sort of bring it up a little bit. But I'm going to start by bringing it down a little bit, which is that I want to go back to Ed's last slide, which showed if we can achieve this goal that you were setting by 2030, you saw the emissions inflect down. That would be if the entire world could do that, right? Though, because if you look at the United States, we're about 20% of global warming, and if you turned off our carbon emissions tomorrow, in fact, the curve would go up. So my first question to both of you is: how is this the sensible path to bring the world along? Is this the right sort of way for everyone to be thinking it? If not, how do you adjust it so it can work in China and India and Russia and all these other, Mexico, all these other high-emitting parts of the world?
Well, I addressed that a little bit in my comments about China. Obviously, they've set, they have a process of setting a 5-year plan. So in a planned economy, which is less planned than meets the eye. But they've set relatively aggressive efficiencies targets. They've concentrated on buildings. The problem is that when that gets implemented, I think at the regional level and city level, they still need to make their economic growth targets. So when they've actually gone back and looked to see whether they're hitting those sustainable targets, I think they've found themselves coming up short. But I think so have we. So I think that it seems to me that we need to learn from the places that have done it best in the U.S. If you look at per capita energy consumption in California from 1970 to today. It's remained flat. In the rest of the country, it's gone up by 60%. So that with the right push, with the right economics, with the right policy, we see that happening. You can go to Japan, which is highly more efficient, or you go to Europe, which I think obviously creates more efficiency in their system. That's resulted in, to some extent, take California, higher per unit cost of energy, but not necessarily higher energy bills. So we need to learn from those domestic examples, but then we need to create partnership particularly with the big emerging economies, with the Russias, the Brazils, the Indias, the Chinas in the world.
Yeah. Ed, have you been grappling with the international issues too?
Yeah. And I've been over to China and we've talked to them about the building sector and how to get that going. But I think what's encouraging now is with the new administration getting on board with climate change, you have now the U.S. Getting serious, you have the EU very serious, and you have Japan very serious. If you look at those three entities, they purchase over 70%, way over 70% of everything that China produces. And so if the U.S. takes a leadership position with the other two entities, then I don't think China and India have any options. I think they have to follow, because we're not going to impose restrictions on emissions on U.S. goods and services and let all this stuff come into the country where we're emitting like crazy. So we have huge leverage. And so what's so exciting is, and hopefully this is upbeat to your downbeat question, is that now the U.S. is engaged. And with the U.S. engaged, there's tremendous hope that the other countries will come along, I think in part because they have to come along.
Because we have an abbreviated question and answer period, I'm going to ask one more question now, and then I'm going to go out to the audience. I may inject some more questions after that, but I wanted to give other folks a chance to ask questions. So formulate your question while I'm asking my next one, which is, I read a Pew Center for People in the Press had a poll that came out in January that asked people to rank the 20 most important issues for them, and number 20 on this list of concern, of the least concern, was dealing with global warming. How important is that for moving forward with policy? Do you need public to be alarmed and to be concerned this is a huge issue?
I'll take this one first then. John talked about the global situation and why we should be concerned about the global situation. And we didn't mean to downplay Bangladesh at all, because it's there are very serious consequences with sea level rise with Bangladesh. The reason we focused on the U.S. was exactly that reason. In order to get the U.S. to move, you have to get the American public to move, and you have to get them engaged. And what we wanted to illustrate was that we're under threat as much as Bangladesh. There's no difference, in a sense, between our migrations and the destruction of a tremendous amount of infrastructure with 1 meter of sea level rise as Bangladesh. Now, we know that the people are worried over there. We should be just as worried. And that was the whole reason that we took our focus into the U.S. to say, hey, we better wake up. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble. And so that's how that came about.
I think that when people are losing their jobs and losing their houses, and you say, are you going to worry about climate change? And particularly when people project that out as a kind of 50, 100-year problem, the answer is going to be what Pew got. I think, though, that when you tie climate change to the promise of a clean energy future, the numbers shift. And I think the public is highly supportive of the policies that it would take. And even to some extent, you look at this and you take it down to state ballot initiatives. Maybe that's the purest form of democracy. And you look at it, a place like Colorado, where the utilities ran against a renewable electricity standard, saying, it's going to raise your electricity rates, and people still overwhelmingly voted for it. They want to see I think they get the connection between where we're going in the future, the linkage to security, particularly on the oil security side, the need what that does to us economically, what it does to us from a security perspective. So I think they're highly supportive of transformational policy. Whether or not they're going to say that that's going to rise to number one on the hit parade, I think is maybe something of less consequence. They get the linkage between security, the economics, and the environment. And I think if you look at where the future is, there's a definite difference between where young people are and where people in my generation are in terms of their understanding that their future's at stake, and they're highly motivated by this set of questions.
Yeah, one thing that I found very appealing about your presentation and your idea was, in fact, you appeal to people's pocketbook, and so you don't actually need them to be convinced that it's the world's biggest problem. You have to convince the politicians, however, to front load it with all the money you were talking about.
Well, one of the great opportunities that we have now is this deepening recession, and I don't mean to be flip about it, because there's a lot of people that become hurt by this. But it presents a once-in-a-lifetime huge opportunity to address all of these issues at once, because they converge, and the solutions in each area, in each one of the crises that we're talking about, happens to reinforce the best in moving forward on the other fronts. So we, in a sense, don't have to deal with the fact that climate change is number 20 on somebody's radar scale if we're addressing the other issues, and we're addressing the energy issue, and we're addressing the housing crisis, and we do it in a way that's smart. We also address the other issue, and we get a handle on all four, by the way.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. I believe that there's a microphone here, so raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and please introduce yourself. You want to start in the middle there? Yeah, I'll give you the hardest one, Scott. Right dead center of the audience.
When speaking about international
I'm sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Sean Quinn. I'm an architect and master of science and an environmental design student over at Catholic U. When talking about international development in terms of the energy crisis, you spoke mainly as carbon capture is one of the main objectives. Why not issues like solar power in India, or looking at geothermal in China, or how much are those being looked at as main objectives for development there?
Well, yeah, let me take that. I think that I wasn't trying to eliminate those. I was just saying I was actually addressing the carbon capture question with China in particular, because China's building a large coal-fired power plant, basically one a week, and they have abundant coal reserves, and they're going to burn a lot of coal, and I think it has become there's a healthy debate in the U.S. about whether we ought to abandon capture and sequestration as a strategy, because it's big, it's expensive, it's untested. We haven't really run a serious development program, demonstration program that really tests its viability both economically and environmentally. And there are different paths in the U.S. to bring on and stream in renewable energy and in a way that's potentially more effective and cheaper for the U.S. economy. And the reason I raised it was because I think that I guess I'm a little bit unprepared to abandon capture and sequestration because of these problems in the rest of the world, because coal is such a important fuel source in China and fuel source in India, that if we sort of abandon the field and they continue to burn coal and vent it into the atmosphere, it goes back to the first point that over the long term we're not going to bend emissions to the degree globally that we need to. But I think there's great potential working with partners. There's vast geothermal resources in Africa. There are potentials for done properly for for biomass to be used as a fuel source, particularly in coal-fired generation. There's, I think we need all of those technologies brought up to scale. And there's a scientific base around the world. All knowledge doesn't reside in the United States. It's a global problem and needs a global cooperative solution. And so I wouldn't discount all the things you mentioned at all. But I think a lot of, particularly people on the environmental side now, are ready to abandon capture and sequestration. I think if we do that in the short term, I don't see China abandoning coal, and I don't see India burning coal anytime in the fairly near future.
Well, unfortunately, one of the problems with carbon capture and storage or sequestration is that it doesn't really work with the existing plants. So you ultimately, I think the question, you do have to figure out some way to deal with the existing plants and figure out how to phase them out. But for future coal, absolutely. More questions from the audience. Over here. Well, oh, I'm sorry. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Mr. Mazria, can you tell us anything about how your bill is doing in Congress?
How
your proposal is doing in Congress?
I don't know. Maybe we need to ask John that question. We've talked to a number of congressmen and staffers and sent it into the transition team, but we're not aware at this point of where it is. Tom Udall was going to introduce a bill, an amendment with the stimulus, but it looked like the stimulus was getting cut, and it was thought that it was not the right time.
Do you think that there's still time to deal with this in the current?
Well, I think that the appetite to spend money is still, I don't know whether it's been sated. We just passed a $787 billion bill. I think there's an opportunity to have this proposal considered in large part because it leverages so much private capital against the public investment. And whether the CBO would agree that it pays for itself, I leave to our friends at the CBO and the OMB about how they would actually score spending $100 billion a year. I got the numbers right.
Let me just explain what the issue is. We track, and the AIA tracks, along with Dodge and McGraw-Hill, tracks fees and income in AE services. And what we've seen is that in 2007, all of a sudden the AE fees in the private building sector fell off a cliff. And it's been off that cliff now almost for a year. In the public building sector, however, fees remained steady. So there was a lot of design going on up through, I want to say, July and August of this last year. And then you started to see a decline. Now,
states pulling back.
What's that?
With the states and municipalities
yes,
pulling back.
Yeah, it's mostly public building, yeah. Right, all public building. That's schools, and actually in November of this past year, school construction was up 6%. Public buildings, government buildings were up 6%. Construction, because those projects start way before. You got to float the bonds, you got to do the drawings and all that kind of stuff. So we're not going to see a downturn in the public building sector for another probably few months, given the lead time that it takes when the money comes in and the drawings are finished to the time that construction starts to go down. You will begin to see that. But again, that's only 7%. So what the stimulus does is it doesn't let that part of the building sector exacerbate the situation. It's shoring that up by pumping money into schools now and into public buildings. But
do you need, though, a healthy economy to do this? I mean, people now are feeling very skittish, and even if you are offering them really low mortgage rates, how many people are going to say it's time for me to remodel my house or it's time for me to go buy a new house?
In a heartbeat. If I can, people jump out of their seats when we talk about this. If I can go from $1,600 a month to $1,200 or $1,300 a month, and I can. And my wife's been bugging me to recarpet, and I can throw that in on top of all the efficiency stuff I have to do. Are you kidding? you'd have people lining up at the door, and you'd be putting people back to work. Again, if we don't address the private building sector, we just not going to get out of this hole. I can tell.
There will be an energy bill this spring. There will be a climate bill, I think, at least through the House in the summer, and there'll be a tax and budget bill in August. So I think there's opportunity to consider this idea.
Mm-hmm. Scott, where are you? Okay, go over there. I'm trying to, yes. Please introduce yourself.
Mike Kennedy. I guess I'm very encouraged by what Ed has said, and I think it really is a real opportunity for us to create a win-win situation. Like everything, if you create a model for something that works, the rest of the world is going to follow it. If we create a model that shows that creating green jobs and doing that by taking it down to the calculus of rooftops and retrofitting houses and buildings works, I think that solves the problem around the world. It doesn't solve the whole problem, but it certainly goes a long way. And China really has the most to gain. They're the biggest investor
do you
in
have
our
a question?
economy.
I'm sorry, do you have a question?
I just wanted to say that I think that, I'm agreeing that this is a very encouraging situation.
I appreciate your comments. Thank you. Behind you, Scott.
Ed, Bruce Reed, can you talk about the legislative strategy for your building standards, your building energy standards, and the ratcheting up of those?
Well, there's a coalition that's formed that we've been part of, and we've been pushing the coalition to get out front on this situation. We have about, I think, 30 organizations that get on a 1 hour, 2 hour conference call every week. And I think we're about at the point where we'll come together to recommend the 30% below code immediately, since we're approaching 2010. So whenever the legislation goes into effect, it would be 30% below IECC 2006 and ASHRAE 90.1 2004. For those of you who don't know it, it's a commercial and residential building. Most of you do probably. Building energy standards. So, and then by 2016, phase in a 50%, because we know that 30% is so doable and it's cheap. It doesn't cost very much, and the payback is only a few years. And if you rate it into a 30-year mortgage, you make money every year. So that standard, the 30% standard, should be very easy to get through, and the 50% I think also. What the legislation that's being written now that we'll get before Congress, I'll talk about it next week at the Senate Energy Committee hearing, is after that what happens. And right now I think these groups are looking to the DOE to set that in motion after they see how things go. We'd like to see it actually part of the bill, the energy bill. So we'll push out in front, and we don't know where it'll happen. But I'm almost certain the 30 and 50 will get in there. I think we also all agree that there should be reach codes. The reach codes are critical. You've got to allow the cities and states who want to adopt even go further, and you've got lots of them who want to go further. You got to let them be able to do that because it provides all those examples, so that when you get to the next stage, here are all these examples. They work. Yeah. One last thing: there's a preemption problem that has to be dealt with. Right now, cities and states can't go further because they preempt these appliance standards and stuff that have been set, and you have lawsuits going on all around the country now about these standards. That has to be dealt with in this energy bill legislation.
Do we have time for a couple more? One more. Why don't we take one from back here?
I'm Art Gazzetti. I'm with the American Public Transportation Association. When we talk about buildings, the efficiency of the building itself is one element, but I would suggest that perhaps the location of the building is another important element. You can be a LEED certified building and be located, in a place that's going to be forever a consumer of energy and forever a symbol of consumption of energy. So to what degree does the location is important, and how can that be built right into the standards when we do certify buildings as being efficient?
At the last Congress for New Urbanism, Congress for the New Urbanism National Conference, I think it was the one before the last, I was a keynote speaker on the last day, and what we proposed was a 2030 planning challenge, which the Congress for the New Urbanism adopted, and we try to get it adopted by the ULI and other organizations, which we presented at the ULI conference. And that calls for a 50% reduction in vehicle miles traveled in all new developments and regional planning projects. We call for a 50% water consumption reduction and a 50% building energy consumption reduction. So in a planners have huge control over what goes on in large-scale projects because they set the requirements. So we issued that challenge, and I'm happy to say the CNU adopted it, and we're still waiting for some of the other planning organizations to do that as well.
John?
So we do need to address, you're exactly right, we need to address that.
John, do you have a sense of whether that's on the radar screen here in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think that the kind of movement towards smart growth is really, I think, a critical part of the conversation in D.C. and globally, because I think that you take up these challenges, and particularly in the megacities around the world, and they're critical to being able to. That's where the energy consumption is. That's where we need to reduce CO2 emissions, and smart design systems, both on the transportation and building side, are critical to implement that. I'll just add one more point to the intersection of the transportation and the building side. We're rushing towards electrification of the transportation system as well. So I go back to the critical question of having the resources and the intelligence in the grid, the capacity to get renewables to market, because we're gonna add to the load on the grid, but we also can use the storage capacity if we actually make that leap towards electrification through plug-in hybrids, et cetera, to be able to deal with peak load issues and questions like that as well. So I think you can isolate and put buildings and transportation and industrial applications in silos, but in the end of the day, they do interconnect. There needs to be a joint strategy, and there needs to be intelligent design coming from Washington in the very near future, I think.
Well, thank you both very much. It was a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you.